You're lying in a hospital bed. There's a wound on your leg that won't close. It's been 3 weeks. The skin around it has gone a dull, angry red, and this morning the nurse didn't smile when she changed the dressing. She just said the word debridement and left the room. Then a doctor walks in holding a small sealed container, and inside it, moving, are maggots. And she tells you, calmly, like this is normal, that she's about to put them on your open wound, on purpose, as treatment. So why would a modern hospital, with every antibiotic ever invented, sitting in a cabinet down the hall, choose to heal you with fly larvae? That's the actual question. Not gross, why would anyone do that? But why did doctors, across completely different centuries, on completely different continents, independently arrive at the exact same answer? Maggots save limbs that medicine otherwise can't. Here's where it starts. Not in a lab, on a battlefield. Napoleon's era, early 1800s. Battlefield surgery meant one thing above all: get to the wounded before infection does. But there wasn't always time. Soldiers lay for days in field conditions before a surgeon reached them. And French army surgeon Dominique Jean Larva, who treated tens of thousands of casualties across Napoleon's campaigns, noticed something surgeons weren't supposed to want to notice. The wounds that had been colonized by fly larvae, left in mud and heat long enough for flies to lay eggs in them, were, disturbingly, doing better. Cleaner. Less gangrene. Larva documented it. He didn't fully explain it. He just wrote it down. Because a good surgeon writes down what he sees even when it doesn't make sense yet. Fast forward half a century. American Civil War, 1860s. A Confederate surgeon named John Forney Zacharias is treating soldiers with wounds so severe that infection alone was killing more men than bullets were. And he watches the same thing Larva watched. Wounds crawling with maggots, and those wounds, somehow, healing faster and cleaner than the ones kept sanitary. He later wrote that he intentionally let maggots colonize certain wounds, and called the results, in his own words, remarkable. 2 wars, 50 years apart, 2 surgeons independently landing on the same forbidden observation. Now here's the moment where your assumption should be doing backflips. You'd think introducing insect larvae into an open wound is the fastest way to make an infection worse. Add bugs to a cut, get a worse cut, that's the obvious math. The truth is the opposite, and that gap, between what seems true and what is true, is the entire story. So what's actually happening in that wound? Maggots, specifically the larvae of the green bottle fly, Lucilia sericata, don't eat living tissue. They physically cannot digest it efficiently. What they're built to consume is necrotic tissue, dead, decaying flesh. Exactly the stuff that infection thrives in. They secrete digestive enzymes onto the wound that liquefy dead tissue on contact, then they drink it. Like microscopic, self-propelled surgical debridement tools that also happen to excrete ammonia and other compounds that raise the wound's pH, just enough to make it inhospitable to several strains of bacteria. They are, functionally, tiny biological scalpels that only cut what's already dying, which, if you think about it, is a more precise definition of surgeon than most of us learned in school. This still wasn't science yet. It was folk observation, passed down like a slightly disgusting family recipe. And it wasn't only Western battlefield medicine. Aboriginal Australian communities and Maya healers in Central America both independently used maggots or maggot-adjacent techniques on wounds long before any European surgeon wrote a word about it. Which means this wasn't one lucky discovery. It was discovered, forgotten, and rediscovered over and over by people with no contact with each other, because the biology simply kept proving itself true, whether or not anyone believed it. Think about how strange that pattern actually is. Normally, medical breakthroughs spread because someone publishes a paper and the rest of the world catches up. This one spread the opposite way. It kept getting invented independently, in isolation, by people staring at the same evidence and reaching the same uncomfortable conclusion. That's not folklore. That's data with unusually bad public relations. And the biology behind it is more specific than bugs eat gross stuff. Larvae don't just liquefy dead tissue at random. As they crawl across a wound bed, that movement itself has been linked, in later wound care research, to increased local blood flow and faster formation of new tissue at the wound margins. So they're not just removing the problem, they may be actively encouraging the repair. Less cleanup crew, more cleanup crew that also leaves the place looking better than they found it, which frankly is more than I can say for most house guests. The man who finally turned it into actual medicine was an American orthopedic surgeon named William S. Baer, working at Johns Hopkins in the 1920s. Baer had treated soldiers in World War I and, like Larva and Zacharias before him, noticed wounded men whose fractures had gone untreated for days in the field and were crawling with maggots, healing with less infection than the men who'd received prompt, clean medical care. Instead of filing that away as a battlefield curiosity, Baer took it into the hospital. In 1929, he deliberately introduced sterilized fly larvae into the wounds of patients with chronic osteomyelitis, a brutal bone infection that, at the time, had close to no reliable cure and frequently ended in amputation. Osteomyelitis, if you haven't encountered it, is infection that has burrowed into the bone itself, which is exactly as bad as it sounds. Before Baer's work, patients with a stubborn case faced repeated surgeries, months of hospitalization, and often amputation as a last resort, with no guarantee even that would stop the infection from spreading. Baer selected patients who had already failed conventional treatment, people surgeons had essentially run out of options for, and applied sterilized maggots directly to the infected bone and surrounding tissue. His results, published in 1931, showed dramatic healing in patients considered close to hopeless. Wounds that had refused to close for months began closing in weeks. Maggot therapy went from battlefield accident to hospital protocol in the span of about a decade. By the mid-1930s, hundreds of hospitals across the United States were using it, and a small industry had sprung up specifically to breed and ship sterile medical-grade maggots to hospitals, which is a sentence I did not expect to type either. And then it almost vanished completely. Because in 1940, penicillin arrived. Here's your rhetorical gut check. What do you do with a slow, slightly horrifying, labor-intensive living treatment when a pill can do the same job overnight? You drop it, which is exactly what medicine did. Antibiotics were faster, cleaner, and required no one to explain to a patient why there were flies in a jar on the counter. By the 1950s, maggot therapy had all but disappeared from mainstream medicine, filed away next to bloodletting and leeches, as things we used to do before we knew better. Except we did know better. We just forgot why it worked. Now here's the twist that should genuinely unsettle you, because it's the reason this story isn't history, it's current events. Antibiotics are failing. Antibiotic-resistant infections, the kind that don't respond to anything in that hospital cabinet, are one of the fastest-growing causes of death worldwide. The World Health Organization has named antimicrobial resistance one of the top global public health threats facing humanity this decade, which means the exact problem maggots solved for Larry's soldiers and Baer's patients, infections that ordinary treatments simply cannot touch, is becoming, again, a modern problem. Bacteria evolved around our chemistry. They have not evolved around getting eaten. So starting in the 1980s and 90s, an American physician named Ronald Sherman began doing what Baer had done 60 years earlier, except this time with the tools of modern microbiology behind him. Sherman ran clinical studies on maggot debridement therapy for chronic wounds, particularly diabetic foot ulcers, one of the leading causes of amputation in diabetic patients worldwide. His research, published through the 1990s and 2000s, found that maggot-treated wounds cleaned out dead tissue faster than surgical debridement alone, and in several trials, healed at comparable or better rates, all without a single antibiotic being administered. Sherman didn't stop at "it works." He wanted to know why it kept beating conventional treatment in patients who'd already failed everything else, and part of the answer turned out to be selectivity. A scalpel, in the hands of even a skilled surgeon, can't always tell the difference between tissue that's borderline salvageable and tissue that's already dead. So surgical debridement sometimes removes more than strictly necessary, or leaves behind small pockets of dead tissue that reignite infection. Maggots, guided by chemical cues rather than a surgeon's eye, consistently avoided living tissue and targeted only what was already gone. In other words, an organism with no medical degree was, in this one specific and extremely narrow sense, out-precisioning trained surgeons. In 2004, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration formally cleared medicinal maggots as a legal medical device, which, quietly, makes fly larvae one of the only living organisms the FDA has ever approved as a treatment, not a drug derived from them. Let that sit for a second. There is, right now, a small population of lab-bred, sterilized green bottlefly larvae that are legally classified alongside pacemakers and surgical stents. Somewhere, a regulatory scientist had to write a compliance document for a bug. I'd love to have seen that meeting, and they don't just sit in a jar waiting to be prescribed. Medical-grade Lucilia sericata are raised in dedicated, climate-controlled facilities under conditions strict enough to qualify as pharmaceutical manufacturing, fed a sterile diet, and shipped to hospitals inside specially designed dressings, sealed enough to keep the larvae contained and breathing, but permeable enough to let waste products pass through, so the whole system functions less like a jar of bait and more like a very small, very purposeful greenhouse. Somebody engineered that. Somebody's entire job, at some point, was optimizing airflow for medicinal maggots. Let's stack the numbers, because this is where the story stops being quaint and starts being genuinely staggering. Diabetic foot ulcers affect roughly 1 in 4 people with diabetes at some point in their lives, according to global health data compiled by the International Diabetes Federation. Left untreated or poorly treated, a significant share of those ulcers lead to amputation, and once someone with diabetes loses a limb to infection, 5-year mortality rates rival some cancers, a comparison made repeatedly in vascular medicine literature. Now combine that baseline risk with the rise of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, which the WHO estimates already contribute to over 1 million deaths annually worldwide. Now combine that with the fact that maggot debridement therapy, in Sherman's own published trials, cleared dead tissue in a median of under a week, versus multiple weeks for standard wound care in comparable patients. Stack those together and you get an uncomfortable modern math problem. A treatment we abandoned for being primitive may be one of our better answers to a crisis we caused by being too clean, too fast, and too reliant on one class of drugs. So here's your rhetorical gut punch, and it's a fair one. If it works this well, why does it still feel like something out of a horror movie instead of standard care? Partly because it's a hard sell. Try explaining to a frightened patient, calmly, that the plan is deliberate insect colonization. Most people's instinctive response is somewhere between absolutely not and visible recoil, and doctors know it, which is part of why maggot therapy is still usually offered as a later option, after more conventional treatments have failed, rather than a first-line choice. There's also a practical bottleneck. Medical-grade maggots have to be bred in sterile, controlled facilities, packaged in specific dressings that let them breathe and feed without escaping. Yes, that's an engineering problem someone has actually had to solve, and shipped with a shelf life measured in days, not months, unlike a bottle of pills sitting in a warehouse. But the clinical logic hasn't gone anywhere. It's the same logic Larva noticed on a battlefield he never wanted to be on, the same logic Zacharias wrote down almost apologetically, the same logic Baer turned into a hospital protocol before it was elbowed aside by a miracle drug. Every single rediscovery of this treatment starts the same way. Someone watches something they were taught to find disgusting and refuses to look away before asking why. And there's a bigger pattern hiding underneath this one, if you zoom out far enough. Modern medicine has quietly gone back to nature for solutions more than once, when its own tools started failing. Leech therapy came back for microsurgery and reconstructive surgery to relieve venous congestion in reattached tissue. And fecal transplants, once unthinkable, are now a recognized treatment for certain gut infections that antibiotics can no longer touch. Maggot therapy isn't a strange outlier. It's one entry in a growing list of treatments that sound like a joke, until you're the patient they're keeping off the amputation table. Which brings us back to you, back in that hospital bed, with the doctor holding that small container. What you're actually looking at, in that moment, isn't a horror movie prop. It's roughly 200 years of surgeons, French, Confederate, American, working continents and centuries apart, none of them talking to each other, independently arriving at the same conclusion about the exact wound in front of you. Sometimes the fastest way to heal something is to let something else selectively eat the part of you that's already dying. Your body isn't being invaded, it's being edited. And the editor, it turns out, has been doing this job, quietly and correctly, since long before we had a name for infection at all. Next time someone tells you that's disgusting, you can tell them it's also, technically, FDA-approved medical equipment, and then watch their face do something interesting. If this kind of medicine's weird, uncomfortable history story is your thing, there's more of it here, so stick around, and let me know in the comments what you want the next one to dig into.